exam higher than the first one. And I know, of course, individually, you might be one that it did not work so great for you, and hopefully the final will be better in that sense. You can come and review your exams starting on Monday on my teaching office hours, and all the rest is just regular. We are ending our final section right now. We already had one lecture about the digestive system. Just like in the previous exam, here as well, there will be one topic, one section that we are not actually covering in the class, but only through VoiceThread, and that's going to be the respiratory system. I wish we could, but time constraints and so on. I just have a VoiceThread. You need to know at the level of the VoiceThread. I'm covering so little of the respiratory, but I just thought about some basics that I want you at least to cover, that we want to cover in this class. So, just like I said for the third exam, remember you don't need to wait on the schedule. I put that in red just to make sure you're not forgetting, but you can do it tomorrow. So don't wait too long with all of this. Your final exam is actually in the later part, so you have a lot of time to study for that. Again, I remind you, it's not actually cumulative. It's going to be the same format, maybe more than 40, but not a lot more than 40 questions, but you'll have 3 hours. So, because it's a final exam. The last thing I want to say before we continue, unless you have some questions, is that this last section that we're going to talk about, the digestive system that we're going to cover in the next 1.5, coming to 2, maybe even 2 lectures, and then the urinary, excretory system, and then the reproductive system, first male, then female. This is pretty intense. Intense just because, again, we don't have flexibility. I cannot postpone something, right? Because I'll talk about it something later. So there will be some cases when I'll rush a bit, when I'll remove some activities that I would love you to do, but we will not do them just for the sake of time to make sure we cover all of this. Stop me if I'm rushing too much, okay? Any questions about the next and last section that we have before we start doing this? So we talked about the digestive system already. We focused on the stomach. We talked a tiny bit about regulation of gastric activity, but you had your readings and your activities to do. I want again to remind you, I put that in the GRQ in red letters, that there's a big, big error over there in one of the diagrams for the book, so make sure that you're not missing it. But we're back, and last time we finished, we just talked about the fact that we have gastric glands and we have the gastric pits, and we talked about we mentioned that there is a gastric juice, and we talked about the chyme, and then we did a detour, and I told you the story of the doctor and that cool story about how we learned about the digestive of the physiology of the gastric and digestive system. We're back now from our detour, and we're going to start talking about the glands. The goal today is to completely cover the stomach, to move to the small intestine, and even if possible to touch the liver a little bit. Today's Thursday, yeah. So next week we're going to complete the story of the liver and the pancreas, and then we just go into the last part. Now we are doing a journey through the digestive system, and we learn each stop in the digestive system, what it's responsible for, right? On next Tuesday, what I want to do is to take the other perspective and to think about the 3 big macromolecules, lipids, proteins, carbohydrates, to follow their journey and to see when and where, how they are absorbed, digested, and so on and so forth. That's what we're going to do. If we have a tiny bit of time, we'll talk some nutrition, we'll see how much. Okay, so we're back in the stomach, and we have 4 groups of cells. Remember, these are the gastric glands, the pits leading to the gastric glands. These still belong to this is what we call the surface epithelium. We already talked about that. And we have 4 groups, the mucous neck cells, the parietal cells, chief cells, and a set of enteroendocrine cells. Entero, digestive in general, anything at the entry, like the enteric system, entero. Endocrine, meaning they're going to secrete what? Hormones, right? And we have different groups of cells. We'll just talk about one, the main one, but there are other groups. Okay. Mucous neck cells, they make mucin. You should know this just by reading about them. So they secrete a thin mucus layer. They don't really secrete mucus. They secrete mucin, protein. When dissolved in water, it becomes a mucus. kind of like the same idea of the surface epithelium. In this case, this is the mucus that will coat the entire layer of the gastric glands here. The parietal cells synthesize and secrete two important factors. One is something that is called, it's a protein called the intrinsic factor, and the second one is HCl. HCl is going to contribute to what? Acidity, right? It's extremely acidic acid. I want to say a word about intrinsic factor. Intrinsic factor has nothing to do with the gastric juices. It doesn't do anything in the stomach. It's just produced, synthesized, and secreted in the stomach. Anyone heard about intrinsic factor? Know anything about it? Vitamin B12, exactly. Vitamin B12, intrinsic factor is not vitamin B12. We'll see why it's important for vitamin B12. Vitamin B12, as any other vitamin is essential. Vitamin B12 is essential for synthesis of nucleotides, division of cells, and so on. You cannot live without it. Okay? We eat B12 when we eat what? Anyone? Animal food, basically. We don't have B12 in plants. And B12 are not made by animals, they're made by bacteria living inside animals' intestines, or stomachs, to be more precise. Or they can be found in other places, typically in non-hygienic food, if you will, because it's part of the feces and you can reach it in different ways. But whatever way you are basically eating or consuming B12, B12 needs to be absorbed, right, from the lumen of the intestine, eventually into the blood. But we don't have any receptors for B12. B12 can, to some extent, pass through the tight junctions, but that's extremely low percentage. And if you eat as much as you eat, if you're on a ketogenic diet, it doesn't matter, then you'll still not get enough B12 in that way. So you do depend on receptors, actual receptors that will bring B12 and absorb it. But we don't have receptors. What we have is an intrinsic factor. It's a protein that basically secreted from the stomach, going into the small intestine, and in the small intestine, it only starts to actually work, and what it does, it binds to the vitamin, to the B12 vitamin, and we do have receptor for intrinsic factor. So you can think about it as a carrier. It takes B12, binds to the receptor, and now B12 will be absorbed through that receptor from the lumen, the space of the small intestine, and into the cells that make up the walls of the small intestine, and from there to the blood. So although it's not part of the stomach, it's manufactured in the stomach, it's essential for vitamin B12 absorption. Yes, David? Exactly. It's coming out with the gastric juice, but it doesn't do anything in the stomach to any food, including the B12. It's made there. And then it goes to the small intestine, where it meets the B12 that made the journey from the food, right? It takes it, it binds to it, takes it to the receptor, and then B12 can be absorbed. If you don't have intrinsic factor, you have a problem because you still have that passive one, but it's just not enough based on your food. Any other question, just to make sure we got the intrinsic factor part? That's a very important nutrient. Okay, so many elderly people with age, they're not secreting enough intrinsic factor. The parietal cells become less and less and less active. There are many younger, not elderly people like myself that you probably know I'm not eating animal food or almost no animal food, right? So there's no B12 in the plants. So how do you compensate for that? Anyone has any idea? What do we do, Paula? You need to take supplements, exactly. We can have B12 supplements. The bacteria are making, we don't synthesize them chemically. It's just too much work. We just let bacteria do it in the lab. But then this helps the vegetarians and the vegans because they don't have the meat. But what if you don't have intrinsic factor? Would that help? Just first of all answer the question before I know you're about to answer to give the solution, right? But what's the problem? If I don't have enough intrinsic factor and I do take supplements, what's the problem? You still cannot absorb it, right? So Dana, what's the So in the past, what we used to do is to give shots right there directly. But today there's something in it, they're pretty painful, but they work. Today there's something actually better. Anyone knows what we do. It's still a supplement, but it's not a shot. And this is not just for B12. There are many types of vitamins and so on that we can help by giving them how. It's orally, but not exactly orally. Anyone knows? Something?
Sublingually?
Sublingual. So what you do, you put them beneath your tongue. How is that? Why is that related? Anyone knows? Andrew. What we have is lots of capillaries beneath our tongue. So what happens with the sublingual vitamin is that it goes into the blood. So how does this solve the problem? We are overriding basically the digestive system. We bring it directly to the blood from our capillaries in the mouth. That's the idea. This is true not just for B12, but it's especially important in B12 because if you do have a problem, then that will solve the problem. If you have a problem with intrinsic factor. Interestingly enough, we actually see, and there's a little bit of research, not too much research, when they compared people who take just regular oral B12 with sublingual, and the oral is actually just fine in most cases, even if you have a problem with intrinsic factor. How come? Remember what I told you, that we also have that very low percentage of absorption from passive absorption, right, in between the tight junctions. Now, if you eat meat, the concentration of B12 are higher than in plants, but are still pretty low. Then the low percentage of pretty low is almost nothing. But when you take a supplement, so there you make a supplement with a 1,000 microns, that's tons. So with so much, even the 1% or even 0.1% that passively go in between tight junctions, more than enough. So sublingual is just kind of like making sure let's override the digestive system, but even orally to work. So that was just a tiny bit of a detour about B12 because it's so important for nutrition. Please note, especially if your main diet, you don't have to be a vegan for that, is based on plant foods, check that. Because B12, it's not like a silent killer like blood pressure, but it's not something that you feel until you really miss that. And we are able to store B12 in our liver for 5 or 6 years, so everything looks cool until it goes below the threshold, and then problem starts. Okay? Yes, Paula? Why they pay for folic acid? Because folic acid in many cases will serve kind of the same goals biochemically wise. For example, for synthesis of nucleotides in DNA replication, and in many cases what you want is to take them both. They don't really need to be together, to swallow them together or to consume them in food together. But it's kind of like if you need that, then let's just take it together. Yes, yeah.
So if you were to swallow your vitamin B12 vitamins, it wouldn't really have much effect?
So if you swallow vitamins, it probably will have an effect, and that's the reason is that if it's high concentrations, then first of all, if your intrinsic factor or IF is good, then you're good. But even if it's low, because we start with high concentration, even that low passive absorption, that is just when the vitamin goes in between the cells with the tight junctions, is just enough because you started with such high concentrations. Unlike when you eat meat, when you start with this concentration and then you talk about this absorption, it's just not enough. That's the difference between supplements in this case. In many cases, supplements, not necessarily a good idea. Right? A lot of fad stuff is going with supplements. This is one case where if you do not consume, you should take B12. Yes? Mainly in adults, mainly the nervous system is starting to suffering. So we feel numbness and we start to feel problems. And there's things that we cannot really trace because it can be your memory starts to suffer. But memory starts to suffer from 20,000 things and you're not sure. You just, some of those things that after people, and it's reversible to some extent if people get shots or supplements. But one of the things you don't want to play with. Okay. We can have the whole discussion just about B12, but it's really interesting actually. Okay, now let's go back to the gastric juice and talk about HCl. I want to talk about the chief cells. The chief cells secrete a protein that is called pepsinogen. Pepsinogen is a protein. It is not, I repeat, it is not an active enzyme, but it's a precursor to an active enzyme called pepsin. Pepsinogen by itself has no enzymatic activity. But if it's activated, it's being modified chemically to become pepsin, an extremely active enzyme, and that enzyme is going to be a protease. So what we see is pepsinogen is activated into pepsin, and we need to have HCl for that, or we need an acidic environment. It doesn't have to be HCl. I'm just zooming in, it's the same idea. Chief cells secrete pepsinogen, and pepsin, when it's activated, when pepsinogen is activated to become pepsin, it's a protease. It digests proteins. It doesn't digest a given protein, it digests many, not all proteins, but it digests many, many proteins. Where do I get HCl from? Where do I get the acidic environment? 1, 2, 3. Parietal cells, right? So you can see how the different parts of the puzzle work together. HCl coming from parietal, pepsinogen coming from chief cells, and we have pepsin. So we can see why HCl is so important. And it's important not only for the synthesis or for the chemical modification that will give us pepsin, but also for the activity of pepsin. So if you create, and you can do it in the lab, you create an acidic environment, right, and pepsinogen become pepsin, but now you move pepsin, you put it in an alkaline solution, pepsin will not work. So you need to keep all the time an acidic environment. What do we need an acidic environment for? For pepsin, right? So it will be active. The other thing is that we talked about plant food. Plant food also come with some material that we cannot digest. We cannot digest, we don't have enzyme that will digest the plant wall, for example. But acidity will kill the plant wall, so then the rest of the plant will be available for us. So pepsin synthesis and activity, it's not just synthesis, and the breaking down the cell walls of plant food. And I'm missing just one part that you all know. What's the third part? Bacteria or pathogens, right? It's the one part of our defense mechanism. Defense against pathogens. When we talk about humans that are omnivores, we talk about it can reach to as low as 2.0 for pH. That's extremely acidic, right? You take a nail, you take something like that, you put 2.0, that will melt it down. Don't try it at home. I mean, you can do it with the nail, but not with anything in your stomach. It's not always like that. It will be between 2 to 5, depending on what you eat. Carnivores that eat only meat, and that means a lot of protein, they will even reach 1.0 of the pH. Okay, we're left with any questions about parietal and chief cells and HCl and pepsin? Yes? Why? Because each enzyme needs its pH for working, for conditional optimization. So that's what we have. We have a very acidic stomach. Okay. I would say we'll talk more about it next week when we'll talk about the different groups, but that digestion of protein is just the first step in the digestion of proteins. We cannot, it just makes it into smaller peptides, that's it. It's the first step in digestion. So we talked about mucus and HCl and pepsinogen. We didn't talk yet about the enteroendocrine cells. As I said, we have multiple and different types of endocrine cells. We will talk about those that we call G cells, the majority of the cells. And they call G cells because they secrete a hormone called gastrin. And gastrin is going to go and stimulate synthesis and secretion of HCl and pepsinogen, especially HCl. If you don't have gastrin, you will still make pepsinogen, you will still make HCl, but in the presence of gastrin, you'll make even more. When you guys read about regulation of gastric activity, you probably saw gastrin because it's one of the ways by which we stimulate gastric activity. We tell the G cells make more gastrin, the gastrin will tell the parietal cells and chief cells be more acidic, let's make more pepsin. Okay, I talked a lot. Let you think a bit, read about this, and I'm going to activate the LC. A and B. First of all, what's wrong with B as a sentence, not as answering or not answering the question? What's the problem with B as a sentence? Chief cells don't make HCl, right? But parietal cells make HCl, right? So if we kill the parietal cells, that will be lack of HCl secretion, right? Just a sentence, as a sentence, true or false, not answering the question. Yes, right? Lack of HCl. So why doesn't it answer our question? Because we have heartburn, and heartburn is not a problem with the heart. We just feel it as it's in the heart because we feel it in the stomach and it's close to the heart, right? And all the pain is not because of lack acidity, but actually of excess of acidity. But we have an option with excess of acidity here at the end, and many of you said did not choose D. Some of you did, but many of you did not. What's wrong with D as a sentence? If I gave you an exam, a true-false question with D, yes? Right? G cells stimulate HCl synthesis and secretion. So if you kill the G cells, you would expect lack of, or lower the normal levels, not killing. And the answer is indeed C. And that's Helicobacter. It took many, many years to understand what's going on with Helicobacter. Many of us actually have Helicobacters, but they're not active. Most of the bacteria do not survive the stomach. There are some types of bacteria that can survive, but they're not really active. Helicobacter is a mean bacterium, I guess, or bacterial strain. Basically, it's able to protect itself. So what it does, it penetrates through the mucus, it protects itself with the mucus, and that causes the problem. So the ulcer itself, and someone got a Nobel Prize for that actually, is because we penetrate the protective layer. And this comes to the basic idea of why we actually need the mucus. We need the mucus because those cells of the gastric glands secrete that extremely acidic juice. But that juice doesn't know one from the other. Just juice is just acidic. So the same way as it kills the bacteria, it will hurt our own cells. So we need to protect our own cells that just made the HCl from the HCl. And that's the mucus, right? If we're going back here, it's hard to see here, but there's a thin layer of mucus covering all of this. And if it goes up, we know this, sometimes it happens, or if you vomited, it can happen. The esophagus is not as protected as the stomach, and this is why you feel it so burning here in the esophagus when the gastric juice goes up. How do we go about treating Helicobacter? Trying with antibiotics when it works. Unfortunately, it doesn't always work. Helicobacter can be really a problem ulcer. Ulcer can be really chronic for many people. They try different things. There will be dietary regimens that are not solving the Helicobacter issue. They're just making the food less acidic, so the heartburn and all the ulcer will not be as bad. Of course, it also affects digestion of proteins and so on. Not a good thing. Not fun. Okay. So you guys just hypothesized the pathophysiology of gastric ulcer, and now let's talk. You read about this, so preparing for the next step of the intestine, Let's answer this one. Responses, the last ones. So most of you said D, secretin, but about a third of the class said all of the above stimulate secretion of HCl in the stomach. And I asked about not stimulate secretion of HCl. So basically it's either you agree. So first of all, why is E wrong? E is wrong. Why is E wrong? First of all, before we talk about secretin. Smell of food. Will smell of food make us secrete more HCl? Taste of food. How do we call regulation of gastric activity? How do we call this phase? Cephalic, right? Now, phases, typically when we use the term phases, we think about time. In this case, we think about areas, locations. Although sometimes they have something to do with time, it doesn't have to be. So we have the cephalic, you smell the food, you saw the food, you thought about food, you're starting to prepare the machinery, right? So starting to prepare the machinery involves gastric activity, involving gastric juice. So they will actually stimulate secretion of gastric juices, including HCl. So secretin is the one that does not. Where is secretin secreted from? Nicole. It's not from the pancreas and not in the liver. Anyone else knows? Oh yeah. In the small intestine, including the duodenum, what part of regulation of gastric activity, which phase is secretin involved in? Intestinal, exactly. Right? So intestinal, although it has a very short, mild positive feedback, it's mainly negative feedback, right? Okay, what's the logic here? Let's think about the rationale. Why would we expect the small intestine to inhibit or not stimulate HCl secretion? Sia. Yeah, the idea is, we mentioned it briefly last time, is I typically use the analogy of an assembly line. Here we'll talk about two assembly lines. Here on my right, your left, okay, we have one assembly line, that's a stomach, that starts to digest food, prepare it to bring it to the next one. So the product of the stomach is going to be my precursor in the small intestine. But I need to deal with a lot. And I need to digest, need to complete digestion, need to absorb, I need a lot of time. So if I have a problem, then I want to tell the other guys in the previous assembly line, guys, wait a bit. Wait a bit with making the gastric juice, and wait a bit with emptying, sending me your gastric juices. What else do we know about, although we did not talk about the intestine so much yet, what else do we know about the pH in the intestine, if any? If anyone knows. Is it going to be acidic? Dana? It's going to actually be alkaline. Acidic was extremely important in the stomach. One of the reasons was for our protection, killing pathogens. I mentioned the bacterial cell wall. But that was the only stop where we need acidity. Pepsin is the only digestive enzyme that requires that low pH. All the intestinal enzymes and factors actually need an alkaline solution. So if I'm here in the small intestine, I'm getting a chyme, right? Gastric juice plus food, that is what? Acidic or alkaline? It's extremely acidic. I need to neutralize it, and we'll see how we're going to neutralize it, but it takes some time. So if it's too acidic, what I want to tell the stomach, guys, it's just too much acid over there. Can you go a bit lower with acidity? And secretin will be one, not the only one, but one of those enzymes that will inhibit. And that's why we have the intestinal phase. The intestine is telling the stomach, slow down with synthesis, slow down with secretion, slow down with emptying. Any questions about that part? How the intestine is actually inhibiting the stomach in gastric activity? Again, this is one of those things I want you, don't try to remember. Try to understand the logic. That will help you so much better. Okay. So here's the stomach, and I want to talk a bit about the contraction and the emptying, the food. I want to say the chyme is basically being squeezed out through the sphincter. We talked already about the pyloric sphincter. The muscle, the smooth muscles contract slowly. This is like 3 times or so per minute. They actually have their own, we don't talk about them, but they have cells that are kind of like the autorhythmic cells in the heart. So we can regulate it, just like in the heart, okay? But by themselves, they're pacemaker cells. They don't need to start, they know how to start to turn the switch on. We can just turn the switch, turn it lower or higher, okay? Just like the case of the heart. And then the food will go down from the fundus all the way down to the sphincter, squeezing out 2, 3, maybe 4 milliliters, and the rest is going up and continue to be digested and mixed and so on and so forth. Okay. So when we talk about the sphincter, we talk about gastric emptying. Here it's what I just said. This is basic electrical rhythm is initiated by pacemaker cells. Okay? The chyme is either delivered in small amounts of the duodenum or forced backwards into the stomach for further mixing. Here it's empty. Now, if I have, for example, more lipids, I'll answer the question in just a second. If I have more lipids and more proteins in the food, let's think about 2 dinners. One of them, I just eat fruit. Okay, sugars, tiny bit of amino acids, and that's it. In another dinner, I'm eating a very heavy meal with lots of proteins and lipids and so on. In which of the dinners, the intestine needs a bit more time? In the proteins, right? The protein and lipid-rich protein. So, in which of the dinners, the stomach will be emptied slower? With proteins, right? Because of that intestinal phase, the more proteins, the more lipids I have in the food, the more time the intestine will need, the more secretin and other inhibitory hormones will be secreted, the more time we will hold the food in the stomach. Okay? So in general, the same mechanisms regulating gastric secretion will also regulate gastric emptying. The intestine, I'm talking about the intestinal phase, what we just discussed. If we inhibit gastric activity, synthesis, secretion of HCl, we also inhibit, slow down the gastric emptying. If it's just carbohydrates, if it's fruit, it's going to have like in 30 minutes or so, you're emptying your stomach, but if it's more of a meal, but it's still rich with carbohydrates, it's about 2 or 3, maybe even 4 hours. If it's rich with lipids, we need more time. That will go to 5, maybe 6 hours. Just a second, Diego, then I have a question, and then Diego. Then I was asking about the autorhythmic cells. We call them pacemaker cells. In this case, they are in the surrounding and next layer next to the smooth muscles. These are epithelial cells that were modified. I'm not going to go into the names. So next to the smooth muscles. Diego.
You said that if we have a meal that's more higher in lipids and proteins, we have more
secreted from the small intestine because it needs to deal. You didn't just give me now product that I need to deal with. This is a lot of product, and this is lipids. I need to work harder, emulsify it, complete digestion, absorption, all of this. The pyloric sphincter will prevent backflow. Yes. If you ever read or see anywhere, social media, I don't think people read newspapers anymore, right? But if you read somewhere, I don't know, you're waiting for your dentist and you read something, and you read, eat fruit only on empty stomach, that's the source for this story, which is a complete 100% myth. Okay, you can eat as much fruit as you want on empty or full stomach unless you don't feel comfortable with that, so then, of course, don't do that. The idea, the concept is, you guys will help me addressing this myth. The idea is, if you eat, let's talk about the thing that is actually correct. If you eat fruit alone, right, they're going to be emptied from your stomach pretty quickly, right? But if you eat it after a meal, because of all the lipids and the proteins, they're going to stay for more time in the stomach. So far, so good, right? Fruit are pretty rich in carbohydrates, so the claim is that if they're staying there, they're basically going to be fermented. Fermented is something that will feel the gas, and it's like, this is how you'll feel bad about it because of that, right? So what's problematic here? Why aren't they actually going to be fermented in the stomach, even if they stay? They're going to stay for a longer time. Anyone who learned anything about fermentation, bio 101 level, not the biochemical level. Yes. We don't have anything exactly that will ferment because we need the bacteria or yeast and they're dead, right? Or if they're not dead, they're not active. By the way, we also need anaerobic conditions and the stomach is not completely anaerobic. The bacteria that we do have are aerobic bacteria. So eat your food whenever you feel like it, and if it doesn't make you feel good when you eat, don't eat it at that timing. But don't read newspapers when you're waiting for the dentist. I don't want to tell you, but this is full. All of this stuff and all of those claims are just everywhere. Yes?
So another flavor is like don't eat a certain amount of hours before you go to sleep?
That's another one. That's wonderful. Don't eat a lot of flour for a certain amount of hours before you sleep because your metabolism is going to sleep and then you won't and then you will ferment. No, we're not dead when we're asleep. Our metabolism works. It does work on a bit slower phase. And yes, in many cases, if you eat really just before you sleep, because of the intestine, you have more with gas and so on, and that might make you less comfortable, so don't do that, of course. But it's not really that something is fermenting or something bad goes with the food that is just waiting there. Nobody is really going to sleep. Your intestines are working. Okay. So let's talk about the small intestine. Okay, we prepared for that. We're going to talk about the small intestine and the assisting organs. Small intestine, 3 parts: duodenum, jejunum. I like the jejunum word all the time. I like to say that. Jejunum and the ileum, the lower parts. Each has its own role. Duodenum is pretty small, but it's where all the stuff is going into, drained into. Each has their differences in specific anatomical features, function follows form. We'll focus on the duodenum, but the jejunum is not extremely different. Help me here. How many layers of external muscles are found in the wall of the small intestine? You mentioned that. I just want to make sure we cover this. For propulsion, how many? 1, 2, 3. One of these two, and I'm going to count to 3, but the options are 1 or 2 or 3. Or 0, but it's not 0. 1, 2, 3. Not 3. Why not 3? 2, thank you. Why not 3? Because I told you that the 3/3 is unique to the stomach, right? Because we need those churning movements. But throughout the GI tract, we have 2 layers that are important for propulsion. This is a kind of like a very non-realistic diagram just to highlight the major features here. So here's part of the duodenum. Right, and again, think about the small intestine continuing here. We have a very, very long small intestine. Pancreas here. We have a pancreatic duct secreting all the pancreatic juices that we will discuss next week. Mixture of different molecules. We have the liver here. Please ignore the fact that we have a space. The original diagram did not have the liver, so I photoshopped the liver and I still have that. I need to fix that. But anyhow, there is a duct called hepatic duct. Hepatic, anything with the liver is hepatic. Hepatocytes are the cells of the liver. And we have the gallbladder, okay? All the secretions of the liver, how do we call the secretion of the liver? Bile. The bile is going to go through the hepatic duct, and at some point the hepatic duct and the pancreatic duct are going to become the hepatopancreatic duct. It's very small, short. And all those juices in bile are going to go together